Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Denham, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Xerces Society. We are so happy to have you all here today for our presentation on beneficial insects. And we are joined by Jennifer Hopwood, who is our Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist in the Midwest. So with that, I just want to welcome you all and thank you, Jennifer, so much for being here today.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm really excited to talk about insect allies. We're focusing on the beneficial insects that control pests in your garden and your space today. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about what the Xerces Society is. Our mission is to protect invertebrates and their habitat. Our main office is in Portland, Oregon, and we have regional offices around the country. I'm from a regional office. I'm based in Omaha, Nebraska. And I've been with Xerces about 11 years now, working on all sorts of invertebrate conservation projects. So Xerces Society approaches invertebrate conservation from several different angles. We're involved in education and outreach. We do direct conservation work, of course, working with at-risk species. We're involved in research. We keep up to date with researchers who are active, and then we apply their knowledge and their findings into our conservation actions. But we are also directly involved with research and have a number of partners that help us really apply our findings in creative ways. We also do some advocacy, and we operate several community science projects. And all of this work is not done in isolation. We have partners all around the world. We learn constantly from scientists and apply their findings, as I mentioned. We work with agencies, both local all the way up to federal. I mentioned that we apply conservation findings in creative ways, and land managers and farmer partners have helped us do that in a number of ways. They bring their issues and concerns to us, and together we collaborate to find conservation projects that are successful. We work with companies that support our work and private foundations help us. And then there are also many, many scientists, community scientists, and people out there who are working to protect invertebrates. So thank you to all of these partners. And we also get support from our members. We're a donor-based organization. So our membership and our members provide support that goes directly to our conservation work. And if you want some more information about how to donate or become a member, you can visit our website. So all in all, Xerces works to protect the little things that run the world. And invertebrates are animals without backbones, and they make up approximately 95% of all animal species on the planet. Most invertebrates are insects, and insects make up, all told, about 80% of the world's species. So they're hugely diverse. And we know there are at least 1 million insect species out there, and probably many, many more that are just undescribed right now. And what's interesting is that when many people think of insects, they think about pest insects, pests that cause us direct harm, either with transmitting a disease or causing injury to crops or to garden plants or to domestic animals, or even just insects that are a nuisance. But all told, all those types of pest species make up a very, very small fraction of all the insect species out there, less than 2% overall. So the vast majority of insects are either benign to people, or they're really critical for functioning ecosystems, or they're directly beneficial to our health as humans. So some of the services that insects provide us they include things like recycling nutrients in the soil, or breaking down plants and animals to move nutrients through the system, aerating the soil to improve soil health, improving water quality. They're sources of food for animals, for all sorts of wildlife. They provide us with wild plant pollination that contributes to food sources for wildlife, crop pollination, which provides us with yield and lots of economic value. And then of course today we're focusing on the role that these insects play in pest control. But really our future is tied up with the future of insects. That's how critical they are to us. And today my goals are that you and we come away with an understanding of the role of conservation biological control, and that you become more familiar with key beneficial insect groups. Hopefully you'll come away with concrete steps to support beneficial insects in your space, and then also understand why insect conservation that you do in your space is important beyond your space. So I'm going to start off with, what is conservation biological control? And this quote really captures it for me. The greatest single factor in preventing insects from overwhelming the rest of the world is the internecine warfare which they carry out among themselves. It just really reminds me that the most effective control of insects is applied by nature, especially other insects. And that's what conservation biological control is. It's working with what nature already has going. Conservation biological control manages pests by providing for the natural enemies of those pests. And so we're going to be focusing on strategies to support these beneficial insects in just a little bit. So the work of beneficial insects applies across different landscapes. They do pest suppression in urban areas and suburban areas, in natural areas, and in agricultural landscapes. And it often happens in the background. So we don't have economic estimates of the value of that service, except in agricultural crops. And it's estimated that the value of conservation biological control is anywhere between 4 billion all the way up to 12 billion annually in US crops, and at least 100 billion worldwide. So it's a significant economic contribution. And it does often happen in the background. Many beneficial insects are somewhat unobtrusive. They're very small in many cases, and they can be easy to overlook. This is a parasitic wasp here feeding on this tortoiseshell beetle. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these common beneficial insect groups. One thing to keep in mind about the insect world is it's really, really astonishing. There's nothing that is impossible in it. Insects run the gamut of amazingness. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot of some of these critters today. There's two main groups of beneficial insects. They're the predators, and these are insects that hunt and kill their prey. And then there are the parasitoids, and those are parasites that feed on their host while their host is developing and ultimately kill that host. Some of these insect groups play dual roles in the ecosystem. So in addition to being predators or parasitoids, they might also be pollinators, or they play a significant role in soil health. And although I'm definitely not giving them enough time today, there are lots of other arthropods out there that provide conservation biological control. And this includes a number of spiders, harvestmen, mites, pseudoscorpions, and more. So I'm going to start off talking about true bugs. These are hemipterans, and most hemipterans feed on plants, and they have piercing, sucking mouth parts to tap into plant juices and suck up those plant juices. But there are a group of predatory true bugs, and they use their piercing, sucking mouth parts instead to attack other insects. They will stab their prey, and then they inject a little bit of saliva that contains digestive enzymes. Those enzymes go to work and liquefy the body of their prey, and then they essentially just suck out the contents of their prey's body. That's how they attack their prey. True bugs have life stages of nymphs and adults that look very similar and exist in the same habitat. And in the case of ambush and assassin bugs, both these life stages are predatory. So they are living and eating in the same place. What you can see right here, this is an assassin bug. Assassin bugs are hunters, so they will actively hunt down prey. You can see the very heavy-duty beak right here. These are the mouth parts that they use to attack prey. This is a wheel bug. It's very common this time of year. You can find it in all sorts of habitats, and it has a range from the Southwest all the way up to the Mid-Atlantic, so a decent portion of the United States. Ambush bugs, as opposed to assassin bugs, are sit-and-wait predators, just as their common name suggests. They oftentimes try to blend in on vegetation, and they'll sit calmly and patiently waiting for an unsuspecting fly or beetle or bee to come along, and they'll capture it and eat it. This group overwinters in leaf litter or under bark, and sometimes uses nectar as a supplementary food. Two other predatory true bug groups include the big-eyed bugs. You can see here they've got really tiny or really giant eyes, and the minute pirate bugs, also known as insidious flower bugs. Both of these groups are very, very, very tiny, less than 5 millimeters typically, but they are extremely mighty. They feed on small prey typically, and they are voracious predators despite their size. And just like the assassin bugs, they tend to overwinter in similar habitat under bark, in forested areas, under leaf litter. And now I'm going to move on to groups of predators that have a different lifestyle. Their life stages look different from one another and live in different habitats from here on out. So there are larval stages that have different foods in many cases, or different habitats than the adults. And I'm starting with the lacewings. These are named for their just absolutely gorgeous lacy wings, and they often have giant golden eyes and quite long antennae. The adults can be found on flowers. They'll feed on nectar and pollen really readily. Some adults are predaceous, but it's really the larval stage that's the significant predator. These guys look a little bit like alligators, and they are just as predaceous as alligators as well. The nickname for them are aphid lions, so they will hunt aphids on vegetation voraciously. These guys also overwinter in the leaf litter, in the soil, upper soil layer, sometimes under bark. And lacewings overwinter as adults, so it's the adult that takes shelter in that habitat. So they're most obviously seen in the springtime when they're emerging from their overwintering, and in the fall. So they're really commonly seen right about now at this time of the year too. And so they're active in more cooler weather than many other predators. Flower flies, also known as hoverflies or syrphid flies, are important predators. And it's the larval stage that's predaceous in this group. This is the hoverfly larva right here. It's quite small. You can see it's attacking an aphid, which is at least twice its size. So they are really another example of small but mighty predators. In contrast, the adults feed on pollen and nectar. They are important pollinators, especially in alpine areas and in some crop plants. And this group overwinters in leaf litter and soil. And by now you might be thinking that I'm a broken record about where that overwintering habitat and how important it is, but it's really a thread that unites a lot of these groups. Our next group of predators are lady beetles. This is a really familiar insect to many, many people. And in fact, the value of lady beetles was recognized way back in the Dark Ages, where farmers recognized that when they had lady beetles in their field, they actually had better yields. And in Britain, the nickname of this bird was Our Lady's Bird. This beetle was Our Lady's Bird. Eventually it became known as ladybird beetle, and in the US as a ladybug. But lady beetles are important predators. They're predators as adults, they're predators as larvae. Over here you can see the larval stage eating an aphid. And some species have very specific preferred prey. Some choose to attack mealybugs preferentially. Some choose to attack aphids preferentially. Some choose mites. And they are excellent hunters, and they can work through populations of the prey quite swiftly. The adults also feed on pollen and nectar, and that's really important for their life cycle. These beetles also overwinter as adults, so you can see them in the fall and spring. They overwinter under leaf litter, under bark, under permanent vegetation. That's important shelter for them. And spring blooming plants and fall blooming plants are really important for these groups that overwinter as adults, so that they have that nutrition at vulnerable times of the year. Another group of beetles are the soldier beetles. These are predatory primarily as larvae. You can see this larva down here munching on some insect eggs. Some of the adults are predatory too, but most feed on pollen and nectar. And some of these soldier beetles can be really effective pollinators of certain plants. This group, like the others, overwinters in leaf litter or loose soil. And these beetles have really soft wing covers that are almost a little bit leathery, a little bit flexible. And this particular species that you can see here is a species that's quite common this time of year, particularly on goldenrod, throughout the Midwest, the Great Plains, and into the eastern part of the United States. Ground beetles are a very important group of beneficial insects. As you might suspect from their common name, they're really most active on the ground. Most of the time, they spend their time hunting in the soil or on the ground. Occasionally, there are a few species that do climb up plants to eat prey on plants. Both the larvae and the adults are important predators. And what's really interesting about this group is that they, unlike these other groups that do really rely on pollen and nectar as alternative food sources, this group has a wide range of other foods that they eat in addition to prey. They'll eat a little bit of pollen, but they'll also eat decaying plants, fungi. They'll eat weed seeds. That's especially beneficial in a lot of different situations. So they ecologically are a very, very important group. Ground beetles prefer to nest in grass clumps, preferably bench grasses that are slightly elevated off the ground. And so this has led to some habitat work in agricultural settings to encourage them within fields. And in this picture here, this is a farm in Iowa that has planted what's known as a beetle bank, an extended raised bed of perennial bunch grasses throughout their field. And this is meant to support ground beetles during the winter time. And then come spring, they'll move into the fields and start feeding on crop pests. But they're never too far away from their habitat, so that's where they spend their winters. Our last group of predators are the predatory wasps. And this is a group of a really interesting and diverse group. Predatory wasps hunt other insects and arthropods. Here, for example, you can see a mason wasp who's captured a caterpillar. It's the females that provide parental care. So they build nests and then they do the hunting to provide food for their young. And so they'll build a nest either underground or in a tunnel cavity, and some will actually utilize mud to build small mud nests. And then they bring food to their young. Sometimes they'll leave it whole, or sometimes they'll chew it up, pre-digest it for their young. But it's the adults that are capturing this food and the young that are eating it. The adults actually feed on flower nectar. So to power all their predation activities, they use nectar as energy sources. So they can be frequently found on flowers, and some can be important pollinators of wildflowers in particular. Just like bees, most wasps are solitary, which means that each individual female builds her nest and provides for her young all on her own without assistance from others of her species. It also means that they're very, very docile, that they will not take a chance to defend their nest against danger. So they're very unlikely to sting unless really, really provoked. For example, if you grabbed them in your hand and squeezed, then that would provoke them. But they're very, very safe to be around. There are a couple social wasps. The most beneficial of those social wasps in terms of conservation biological control are the paper wasps that have smaller nests and pose less of a human health risk than do some of the other social wasps. I'm going to showcase a couple of my favorite solitary wasp groups. These are scarab hunting wasps right here. These females will actually dig into the soil when they can detect a scarab beetle larva down in the soil, a grub, and then they'll lay their eggs right next to it and her larva will feed on that grub. There's a cicada killer wasp. These are really common this time of year. They actively pursue cicadas, which are at least twice the size of their bodies, and these are large wasps. And they take those cicadas back to their nest, and that's what they feed their young exclusively. And then there are sand wasps, and this group is really interesting because they continuously feed their young over time. So unlike some wasps would just stock up on crickets or grasshoppers or caterpillars for their young, the sand wasps bring their food to their young as their young are developing. And sand wasps are also becoming particularly important for controlling some introduced species. For example, the brown marmorated stink bug in the east has become a significant pest. And this is one group that provides a little bit of control. All right, so next are the parasitoids. And this is a group of insects that develop on or within their host, keeping their host alive while they develop and then killing their host right at the end of their emergence as adults. So you can see here, this is a braconid wasp, it's a parasitoid wasp. She's injecting her eggs into this aphid, and her larva will grow within that aphid. They'll go through pupation, and then when they're ready to emerge as adult, they will kill their host. And here, over here, you can see a caterpillar which has a ton of pupal cocoons on the outside from which baby wasps will emerge. So in many cases, one host can grow tens to hundreds of these parasitoids. They're very, very effective conservation biological control agents. Parasitoid wasps are the most diverse group of parasitoids. In fact, they're hugely diverse, and it's possible that they are the most diverse group of insects out there, even though there's quite a lot of talk about how diverse beetles are. It's distinctly possible that parasitoids, wasps, leaves them in the dust. If you can imagine every single insect species out there, there's likely a parasitoid wasp for every single species of insect. And in fact, there are even parasitoid wasps for other parasitoid wasps, which is a pretty mind-blowing thing to think about. Most of these wasps are specialists, so they need a certain species of host or a closely related host. And that means that they have a really narrow host range, but that again makes them very effective control agents. They can also persist in environments where prey is really low because they only need a few individuals to produce several hundred or more of their own offspring. They spend the winters within their host. The adults are free living. So you can see an adult wasp, which can be very, very, very teeny tiny, 2 to 3 millimeters, all the way up to an inch or more. But these guys are free living, so they visit nectar to get energy, and then of course the larvae feed within their host. Because some of these wasps can be pretty enigmatic, sometimes it's easier to recognize their activity. And here, this picture is a great example. You can see all these little red aphids here. But some of these golden aphids are the work of a parasitoid wasp. These are what's known as aphid mummies. They're just essentially a husk of what was once an aphid, which indicates that a parasitoid wasp has been there and has developed on that aphid. You can also find emergence holes in insect eggs or evidence on caterpillars, like the picture I had in the previous slide of all the pupal cases on caterpillar. Wasps are not the only parasitoid groups. There are a few beetles that are parasitoids, but the other really diverse group of parasitoids are flies. and in particular tachinid flies, which look a lot like house flies in shape and size. Oftentimes they might be a little bit more bristly and a little bit more colorful. These are not as specific to their host as most wasps are. They have pretty wide host ranges for many species do. All right, and so lastly, although I'm not able to really do them justice, I wanted to mention how important spiders are to conservation biological control. There's really huge diversity of spiders out in our world. Some of the most important groups for biocontrol are orb weavers that build those beautiful giant spiders, spider webs that we start to see this time of year. Sheet weaving spiders, which build sort of crazy webs in across grass. Jumping spiders, which you can see here, and wolf spiders. Both wolf spiders and jumping spiders are active predators, so they'll actively hunt their prey, while orb weavers and sheet weaving spiders use their web to catch their prey, and then they come and consume it. So they're sit and wait predators, ambush predators. Spiders are generalists. They don't usually discriminate. They will take whatever prey comes their way. And some need structure, vegetation structure, while others really rely on leaf litter, especially wolf spiders really need that leaf litter in order to overwinter. All right, so that's a snapshot of some of our beneficial insect groups. And I wanted to move into next what these beneficial insects need in order to provide pest control services. And the short answer is just they need habitat, and they need a place to live, and they need food, and that's what habitat provides. And there's been quite a lot of research that indicates that no matter the landscape, whether it's an urban area, in rural environments, including agricultural landscapes, that the amount of habitat is really directly influential to the diversity and abundance of beneficial insects. And what does habitat provide? Well, first and foremost, it provides floral resources, can be a source of food. This can be an alternate source for some insects just to tide them over when prey is low, but it can also be really critical to the health of some beneficial insects. So some species like hoverflies and lady beetles need protein found in pollen for egg development. And in others, nectar and pollen increases their longevity, it allows them to live longer, and it allows them to produce more offspring. So floral resources are really critical, and oftentimes if beneficial insects have two choices about where to lay their eggs, if prey densities are the same in both choices, but there's one choice with more floral resources, that's the place that they're going to select to lay their eggs so that their offspring have the best chance of success. Habitat also provides alternate prey. So even though there's a focal prey that they might feed on, the most abundant pest in your garden, for example, they also need prey to sustain them before and after that population is abundant. And that's what you can find in habitat. And lastly, habitat provides them with a place to reproduce and a place to survive the winter. That can be, like you heard me say over and over again, it can be the leaf litter, it can be loose soil, it can be bark on trees. For wasps that nest in tunnels, it's stems that's left over. Some really rely on just grassy areas to take shelter for overwinter, or brush piles, or even rock piles or rock walls. So one way I really think about this is if you've got a monoculture, whether it's corn or soybeans or Kentucky bluegrass in the case of lawns, pests really thrive in that situation. There isn't enough plant diversity to support beneficial insects that can suppress pests in that type of environment. So pests can really just abound. And if we want to support these beneficial insects, what we really need is more diverse landscapes. And that really means that what we need to do is think about how to increase diversity of plants to make our spaces more healthy. And this could be thinking about increasing the abundance of food plants in your space. So if you've got a vegetable garden, growing more different types of vegetables or fruits. It can be letting those go to flower. For example, letting your broccoli or cauliflower go to flower after you've harvested it, letting your herbs go to flower. It can also be planting an insectary strip like you see in this picture in the top corner. Insectary plants are just annual plants that you can stick in along the border of your garden or even within your vegetable garden to support beneficial insects with pollen and nectar throughout the season. You can also increase plant diversity in your space with ornamental plants, whether these are perennial or annual wildflowers, bunch grasses. Here in this picture of the flowering curb, you can see this is little blue stem in particular, and that's a really nice bunch grass to support ground beetles and other beetles as well. I mentioned that early blooming and late blooming species are really important for insects like lady beetles and lacewings because those individuals are out as adults in the spring and fall. And particularly flowering shrubs and trees that bloom early are a really critical source of pollen and nectar for those groups. You can increase diversity in your lawn by diversifying from Kentucky bluegrass to include clovers or violets or dandelions or whatever your comfort level is with your lawn. You can use rain gardens as double duty. Habitat can often be multifunctional. It can help water percolate down into the soil rather than running off. And it can also serve as habitat for beneficial insects and other wildlife. I mentioned flowering curbs. That's a great way to stick a little bit of plant diversity in a small space. And if you don't have a yard or a garden, even sticking a sunflower or herbs in a box on your balcony or on your porch or whatever space you have can make a difference. I was an apartment dweller for a long time, and it was always just amazing and wonderful to see what a few flowers could bring. When you're selecting plants for your habitat, no matter your space, it's important to prioritize native plants. And for so many reasons, native plants are really critical for the health of ecosystems, but it's really the most attractive and supportive of the health of beneficial insects. So it's important to prioritize those when you can. And having things in bloom in the spring, to late spring, to summer, into fall, all the way until frost, if you can manage it, is beneficial so that you can support those individuals that have a very short flight season, so as well as those that have a longer flight season. And it's really critical for certain predators and parasites to build up their populations before, for example, before you have a key pest that becomes, before they have a big population surge. And floral resources are a way to do that. So if you've got floral resources around, they have plenty of alternate food sources so they can be building up their population and they're ready to take care of that pest population once it starts to surge. When you're selecting plants, it's important to think about what's suitable for your site to match the plants to soil, sun, and moisture. And in my case, I've been guilty of certainly being optimistic about hoping that a certain plant might be successful in part shade or full shade when I know that it should probably need full sun, but I just go ahead and try it. And then it is quite weak and more susceptible to pests, and ultimately I lose that plant or have to move it. So it's better to just be realistic in this case and select your plants for where you know the conditions that you have. And a last tip for selecting plants for beneficial insects is to focus on plants that have an open floral structure. So here, for example, I've got pictures of coreopsis, of echinacea, of mountain mint, and of a milkweed. And these are groups that have different species that can be found across the United States. This open floral structure is really important for beneficial insects because they have short mouth parts, short tongues. Oftentimes their mouth parts are for chewing in particular. So they need accessible pollen and nectar. And unlike bees, they cannot use a long tongue to retrieve nectar from a flower with a long corolla, like say a penstemon or bee balm. So open floral structures is really important. And although natives have a lot of wonderful, wonderful benefits, and it's important to prioritize them when you can, there are plenty of non-natives out there, introduced ornamental plants that can help provide resources in your garden. So lavender, for example. You can also let some herbs go to flowers I mentioned earlier. Basil, mint, dill, all provide really good floral resources. When you are thinking about plant selection, really be careful when you're looking at varieties. Some varieties are bred for showiness, which makes them, very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, but sometimes that can come at the expense of nectar and pollen production. So some may look gorgeous, but absolutely are useless to beneficial insects and to other animals, like pollinators or hummingbirds or other animals that might visit them. A really clear example are double petal varieties that often don't have flowering parts at all. So be on the lookout when you're selecting your plants. In addition to flowering plant habitat, it's important to think about shelter and overwintering habitat. And the 3 rules of thumb that I usually think about are leave the leaves, save your stems, and plant a log. So what that looks like in practice, for leaving the leaves, it means leaving your leaves where you're comfortable leaving them, leaving a layer on your grass if you are comfortable with that. If not, you can pile them up on your vegetable bed or your flower beds. This provides weed protection, it provides mulch over time. You could pile them under your trees, under your shrubs, under perennial flowers. And having a thick layer, several inches if possible, provides shelter for lady beetles, for lacewings, for flies, for spiders, for so many groups that overwinter in that layer. And beyond that group, those beneficial insects, there's also butterflies and moths and queen bumblebees that use that habitat for a place to survive the winter. So leaving leaves is absolutely critical for a really huge group of insects. Saving the stems means growing plants with pithy or hollow stems. This can be shrubs that are used for food like raspberries or blackberries. It can be other shrubs like sumacs or wild roses or cultivated roses as well. Wildflowers like sunflowers, shopai weed, ironweed. Those species all have thick pithy stems or hollow stems that are used by a number of solitary wasps as tunnels to nest in. And all you need to do is leave your stalks throughout the winter. And if you leave the flower heads intact, you'll have birds that come visit it. It's really wonderful in the fall and winter to watch the birds come and eat seed. In the springtime, you can prune those back. It can be you can cut them back short to 6 inches, or you can leave them to 1 foot or higher. It's totally up to you. 6 inches is sort of the minimum, really, that you would want to leave that length of the stem, because that would allow enough space for that wasp to create quite a number of cells for her offspring. So the higher you cut it back, the more space she has to reproduce. And then you let those go throughout the season. They support wasps, and they also have the advantage of supporting cavity nesting bees. And then they decompose, and the following year you cut back new stalks. And then lastly, you can plant a log, or you can leave a stump. This just means leaving a little bit of habitat. You can stick it behind your showy garden if you would like. So it's not super obvious if you feel weird about leaving a log out. But this just lets all sorts of wonderful insects flourish in your space. All right, lastly, if you've got a place for these guys to live, it's important to protect it from pesticides. And that's really important because a lot of our chemicals, in particular insecticides, can be broad spectrum. So they target not only pests, but beneficial insects. And the consequences of killing off a bunch of beneficial insects can be long lasting. And in part, this is because many beneficial insects have longer life cycles. So they may not have multiple generations of growing season. It may take them a couple years to reach maturity. For example, in the case of ground beetles, they can live for up to 4 years. Spiders have 1 generation of growing season. And so if they're killed off, it can take multiple years for them to recover. And this is in contrast to pests, which can bounce back really, really quickly. Aphids can reproduce in 30 days in some cases. So their populations can bounce back from insecticide applications right away. Another consequence of killing off beneficial insects are that their previously suppressed prey can then surge upwards. So you may be creating another pest outbreak completely unintentionally, and these are called secondary pest outbreaks. So maybe you had lady beetles in your garden that were keeping your spider mites under control, but they got killed off when you were spraying for Japanese beetles. All of a sudden, the spider mites surged forward and created a whole new pest problem. So finding alternatives to pesticides can mean creating situations in which pests cannot flourish. And that really starts with making sure you have a resilient system already. And resiliency means healthy plants. So that can start with having healthy soils, so your plants aren't stressed for nutrients or for water. All that said, though, native plants are really well adapted to a wide range of situations, so they can be plunked down in poor soils and often flourish quite well. As long as they're placed in a place where they've got the proper sun exposure and the soil type. Another thing if you're a vegetable gardener, you can think about resistant varieties. And so this might mean, for example, that instead of choosing Hubbard squash, you go with butternut squash if you have plenty of squash vine borers in your area. Squash vine borers really adore Hubbard squash, and it's quite vulnerable to their attacks, but butternut squash, on the other hand, is more resistant. Another option is to rotate out garden plants within your vegetable beds so that you don't allow pest populations to build up over time. So for example, in my own yard, I have to move pumpkins around quite a lot because of squash vine borers. You can also use trap crops, and to continue with the squash vine borer theme, you could use Hubbard squash as a sacrificial crop. Plant a few Hubbard squash vine borer flock to that and decimate it, leaving your zucchini and pumpkins quite healthy. So that's another option to consider. And this resiliency is really the foundation of a healthy garden. But it's also important to rethink what damage means in your garden. What we want from your garden is or your yard is for it to support life. And so sometimes that means that you'll go out and see that there's been a caterpillar that's munching on your plants. And that's a wonderful thing. That means that you might have a butterfly or moth eventually, or it could mean that your chickadees got fed that day with that caterpillar. You might see these half moon cutout shapes on some leaves, and that's a sign of a leafcutter bee. So sometimes what looks like damage is actually just life using that habitat. And if you've got healthy plants, they can tolerate some level of damage, even beyond, even damage caused by pests. And in some cases, damage caused by pests can produce stress response in that plant that can make it more resistant to pests in the future. So sometimes a little bit of exposure to pests can help make plants more resilient. But lastly, if you don't have pests in your garden, you won't have other life, you won't have beneficial insects. They need those pests to survive. So it is possible to go without pesticides in your garden. If you can try that, I think that's what we would encourage, to try all non-chemical options before you need to reach for that bottle of pesticide, particularly insecticides. But there are circumstances that you may be confronted with in which the health of your plant is compromised and you've tried everything else. So at that point, try to identify the most reduced risk product available that you can use. Make sure you follow the guidance on the label carefully. And then you only want to treat the pests in that particular spot. You wouldn't want to broadcast it throughout your space. One last consideration, some plants come to nurseries pre-treated with systemic insecticides, and some of these insecticides, particularly a few of the neonicotinoid insecticides, can linger a long time in plants or soils, sometimes for several months and sometimes even up to a year or more. And although they show up in the pollen and nectar in just very small quantities, it can be enough that can be detrimental to a beneficial insect. So when you're purchasing your plants, inquire at your nursery to talk about whether those plants have come pre-treated or what they were pre-treated with, so you can make choices when selecting plants. All right, so these steps to think about reducing pesticides to increase plant diversity, these have direct benefits to your space. It might be because you've got more beneficial insects that control pests on your ornamental plants now, or it could be that you have better yield because you have fewer pest problems. But I want to emphasize that these benefits extend not just to your yard, but also to the larger landscape. And right now, those benefits are more important than ever. We are learning more and more about insect declines that are happening. And I'm showing you an example of a really clean windshield because for at least the past decade, entomologists have been noticing that clean windshields are more of the norm than the exception. I remember going on road trips where I need to clean the windshield every time I stopped for gas because I'd get lots of insects stuck along the way. And now it's much less common to have that situation, purely because there are fewer insects in the landscape. And although this is sort of anecdotal, it is backed up by research in the US and around the world that's demonstrating that we are losing insect species and we have less of these species. We have less abundance and biomass of insects in the landscapes. This is across different types of lands as well. Not just in agricultural areas, but also in natural areas. And while we have a lot to learn about what is the best way to monitor these, what are the steps that we can take, we know enough that we need to take action now to reverse some of these declines, to take habitat loss and to take action against overuse of pesticides, to build resilience into our systems, to make them less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We need to take action to support insects and to circle back to where we started, because the fate of humans is really inseparable from the fate of insects. So while though it might be convenient to have a really clean windshield, we need insects and we need them around. And what we can do now is really critical for the future. So I want to leave you with some resources today. We have a great book that provides more information and details about steps you can take to support beneficial insects. It's geared towards producers, particularly farmers, but it has instances of how these can be scaled down in gardens as well, examples throughout. And then we also have a publication, Habitat Planning for Beneficial Insects. You can download this as a PDF free from our website that has similar information. We also have a number of publications geared towards habitat installation and habitat management on our website, including some plant lists that are geared towards pollinators, but many of those plants also provide beneficial insects with key resources. And we have a really wonderful YouTube channel, so you can go back and listen to webinars that have come out previously this summer. 2 weeks ago, there was a really nice webinar on managing pests in your garden. So that might be a good one to check out if you've got specific questions to follow up on pest control and pest management and resilient systems. But we have a wide range of other videos up there as well. It's really great. And we are available on social media outlets as well. So I want to thank you again for being here today, and I'm really happy to take questions right now. And I think we have some time for questions. And if you also want to email me your questions directly, my email is included on the screen. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have a lot of really great questions. So I'm going to start off with questions about lady beetles because there are quite a few. It's a popular bug. Someone asked about purchasing lady beetles. Is that a harmful practice to native lady beetles?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a type of biocontrol known as augmentative biocontrol, and it's a temporary benefit. So it's something in which you could release lady beetles into your garden, but they're unlikely to stick around because they will move to where they prefer to go, their preferred habitats are. So it's certainly a temporary measure. And for farmers who do it, they typically invest in lady beetles to release within a confined space, so a greenhouse or a hide tunnel, something where they don't leave, of course, and they would have to do it consistently over time. So, so that's the first part of your question. But the second part is that some of the lady beetles that they use for release, they breed those in the lab, but they start with harvesting them from a population out west and often from the Sierra Nevada mountains. So we don't know that that's directly harmful, but it's suspected that it certainly isn't great to harvest from populations. And secondly, we do have concerns about moving disease from lab populations around the country. The potential for spreading disease is a concern. So I think it's something to be avoided.
Okay, so another question about lady beetles. A few people have said that they have issues with them coming into their house, but they think they're the Chinese lady beetle. So what should they do with them?
Yeah,
lady beetles.
It's a great question. Yeah, there's a multicolored Asian lady beetle that was introduced intentionally and unintentionally multiple times in the United States. It's an important predator, soybean aphid, but it has also become a nuisance pest. It does enter homes and overwinters in homes and can leave lots of lady beetle poop up in corners of your curtains, for example. And they expel a really nasty chemical when they get scared that can be unpleasant. So what I have done in the past is I vacuum those up and then I freeze them. And yeah, I don't worry about killing multicolored Asian lady beetles. Even though they have conservation biocontrol value, there is some evidence to suggest that multicolored Asian lady beetles compete with native lady beetles, which do not have a tendency to overwinter in homes. So if it's in your house, it's likely to be the introduced species. And I would vacuum it up and freeze that vacuum bag. And that's the easiest way to get them up without having that reflux bleeding that can sometimes occur with multicolored Asian lady beetles.
Thank you. I'm learning so much. It's great. Lots of people are asking about leaving the leaves. And so one person said that they like to make leaf mulch with their leaf shredder, but it sounds like it might be a bad idea for overwintering bugs. So what should they do?
Yeah, I think You know, what you could do, and what I do in my yard is we do mulch some of the leaves into the grass. And then we have lots of big clumps that we just clump under trees or under shrubs. So it's kind of a halfway approach where there's still plenty of leaf habitat, but then you do also get the advantages of the shredded leaves. So that's something to consider.
Okay, great. So there's one person that's living in California, and I know that fires are really a big issue in a few states right now, but how does fire ash affect beneficial insects in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably air quality impacts the ability to forage and ability to fly sometimes. Beyond that, I think wildfires can be damaging to habitats, and they can destroy places where insects are reproducing or overwintering. I'm not sure how ash beyond air quality might have impacts, so I'd have to do a little bit more research into that. But yeah, there's definitely detrimental impacts of wildfires.
This next question is just a definition question. What's the difference between parasites and parasitoids?
Yeah, great question. Parasites usually live and feed on their host without killing it. They just cause harm. Parasitoids actually do kill their hosts, and they do it in a gruesome way. I forgot to mention, but parasitoids have been the inspiration for science fiction writers, and in fact inspired the movie Alien. So yeah, keeping their host alive long enough to grow off them is pretty unique to the insect world.
Yeah, that's pretty brutal. All right. Another question. What is the best way to deter cicada killer wasps? This woman has them in their church pollinator garden, and they're aggressive, and it's right next to a daycare, so they're a bit worried.
Yeah, I can definitely understand why you might be a little bit worried about it. Sometimes males are a little bit more aggressive, or they seem aggressive. What they're really doing is actually just trying to stake out their territory so they can mate with females. Female wasps are the individuals that sting, and so they really don't pose a threat, even though they're large. They don't typically defend their nest. Even though they have that large size, and they can look a little bit threatening, they don't pose a health risk. But it can be interpreted like that because the males are often flying around, trying to posture a little bit and seem tough, so they can capture that territory to mate. So I think the first thing I would say is that I don't know that you need to deter them, but you could put up a sign that says cicada killer wasps in action, keep your distance, because cicada killers are doing a job out there. Cicadas feed on the roots of trees, and so it's important to keep their populations in check as well. I'm happy to talk more about that offline too, if you want.
Thank you. Are there specific species of bunch grasses that are encouraged to support ground beetles, and they're specifically looking for the East Mid-Atlantic species?
Yeah, you could use any common bunch grass. So that could be things like big blue stem Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem, prairie dropseed, or other types of drop seeds that are more common in the Mid-Atlantic. But those are just a couple of the really most common and available things. And if you've got a small space, you don't need a lot to make a difference. So I just have maybe 3 by 8 area of bunch grasses, so it's not very big. And you could go even smaller. There's that you could just plant like 1 or 2 within your vegetable garden, for example, and it could serve the same role as a beetle bank, except it's really more just of like a beetle bump. So it doesn't mean that you have to have a lot of space. Even a little bit can make a difference.
So a few questions about native grasses and leaves, just as far as the timing goes with seasons. So this person lives where native grasses get burned in the early spring, but how late should they wait before they burn to protect overwintering beneficials? And the same for leaving the leaves. When can you remove the leaves?
Yeah, great questions, both of those. So thinking about removing the leaves, I'm always tempted on an early warm day. Usually that happens here in Nebraska, sometimes in March, but inevitably we get another snowfall in April. And so I try to hold off until mid-April to late April. And so when you're, wherever you are, I would look at when you're most likely to have the last frost, and think about maybe a couple weeks before that last frost. Think it's probably okay. I've definitely moved my leaves too early and disturbed things, so it's easy to be tempted. You could always just test it out too and move a little bit and see if things start to fly around. But I would say, just in general, wait a little longer than you think you should, because inevitably, with climate change, we're finding that spring comes a little bit earlier, but the frost dates aren't really changing. So things warm up early, but then we still have later frosts. So having a little bit of protective habitat still around is important. And then with regards to prescribed burns, I think the trick is with burning is it's an important habitat management tool. And so it does, temporarily remove habitat and can destroy overwintering beneficial insects. But if it's something where you can space out the burns in physical space, maybe dividing up your space into different partitions that you don't burn all at once, or if you don't burn every year, that allows populations to recover a little bit better.
Okay, a couple people had questions about the ground beetles eating the weed seeds. Can the ground beetles distinguish weed seeds from other seeds?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Probably they do eat other seeds as well. But that just came directly from some research that looked at the benefits of ground beetles looking in their effect of suppressing weed seeds. So I don't know that we have research to pull from that says that they also can suppress wild plants. So I don't want to take that leap, but my guess is that they are looking for something particular from that seed, some sort of nutrients. So I think I would want to delve into that a little bit more before I can provide a thorough answer to that question. It's a good question.
So this woman has Mexican bean beetles that have been putting lots of holes in the leaves of her beans and sunflowers, and she was hoping that something would eat them. Is insect for them.
And you're wondering what it could be? Is that the question? What type of insect?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bean beetles are probably eaten by larger predators like assassin bugs, or sometimes things like lacewings or lady beetle larvae will attack bean beetle larvae, and sometimes adults as well. So some of the larger predators, I imagine there's a parasitoid out there as well, but I don't know the specific species of them that might be parasitizing. And I think it would probably depend on the region as well.
Thank you. A couple people are asking questions just about how to choose the right plants that aren't treated with neonics, and our pesticide team is coming out with a publication specific to that. I'm not sure exactly when it's coming out, but definitely check our website. But we had a specific question from Dennis. Hi, Dennis. Is progress being made to have Home Depot, Lowe's, and other large-scale plant producers or suppliers phase out the use of neonics?
That's an excellent question. I feel like the pesticide team would be more up to date on that. A few years ago, I think Lowe's made a commitment to label and also to phase out neonics. So they had a timeline for progression that did extend into 2020 and beyond. I don't know about some of the other large stores, the status of their programs, but that's sometimes why asking employees who often may not know the answers But even taking it further up the chain to ask management in the store can be an important step, because consumer voices actually can really go a long way towards making a difference.
I do think Home Depot is committing to phase out as well as Lowe's, but I'm not sure. I think it was by next year, possibly.
I'm not sure. I wish I could answer that, but I think we want to check in with a May code from our pesticide team to double check.
Yeah, she would know for sure. Another question. These are great questions. Thank you, everyone. Do row covers keep beneficials out as well as pests? Should we avoid row covers?
That's a great question, really great question. And I think it's about kind of balancing the use of row cover. So it's a great preventative strategy from your from key pests. So the downside is maybe even more than beneficial insect restriction, it can sometimes restrict pollinators. So if you've got an overlap, if you can use row covers to prevent pests during a key time, but then hopefully open it up and let pollinators in to visit. If it's a flower blooming crop, then that's an important thing to balance. Sometimes beneficial insects can get in there just fine, but it is harder for them to navigate with underneath a row crop. They need light as a cue to help them navigate. So that really distorts it, and it makes it a little bit harder for them to negotiate. So I think using row covers is a good strategy, but yeah, you also need some time without the row cover.
We have a couple questions about flies in general, if they're beneficial, and specifically house flies.
Yeah, so there are a lot of beneficial groups of flies. I mentioned hover flies, which just are really, really, really beneficial for multiple reasons. They can be pollinators, they can be predators, they play a role in soil health. Some of the larvae are soil-based and break up detritus and other important things. So that group is really important. There are some other important groups of flies too that visit flowers, and some others that reside in the soil and play roles as predators or detritivores in soil. So as a group, they're really important. Houseflies fall into certainly the more nuisance category, but they're important food sources for other insects and for other animals as well. And they don't really often play a role in pollination or in biocontrol. Usually houseflies breed in waste or decaying animal material or in decaying vegetation. So they are not commonly involved in biocontrol, but certainly play an ecological role wider.
Okay. Is there a predatory insect for earwigs? This person outbreak in their vegetable garden this year.
Yeah, sometimes earwigs can be so abundant, especially the introduced species of earwig. So earwigs are themselves predators. So sometimes they feed on plants, and some are also predators. And the introduced species, though, I would want to dig into that to find out what are some natural predators of that in our system. They're bigger anyway, and they can defend themselves pretty well with their appendages on the end of their abdomen. So offhand, I don't know specifically what would predate on earwigs, but I think assassin bugs could certainly take them on. Certain types of beetles could take them on as well.
All right. This is an interesting question. This person has a really large garden area. What are your thoughts about planting separate areas just for the pest insects?
Yeah, and are they thinking about vegetable gardens or ornamental gardens? Either way, I think you could draw them away, and it's certainly an interesting recommendation. There's been some experimentation in agricultural settings of having a trap crop, which is essentially what I think this person is proposing, sort of having a plant that's really attractive to a pest, And then they've also experimented with putting insectary plants right around that trap crop to draw in predators to help control the pest on the trap crop. So not only are you drawing the pests away from your focal plants, but you're also trying to draw in more natural enemies to control those pests. So that's a really interesting combination, and it seems that that can be pretty successful in agricultural settings. So I think it could be similar in a yard situation too, as long as you've got more resources for beneficial insects around those sort of trap plants. That's certainly worth experimenting. Yeah, in my landscape, sort of my sacrificial plants are my my wild roses, my Illinois roses. The Japanese beetles just decimate them every year, but then they leave my prairie roses alone. And that wasn't intentional on my part, but it just happens to be the way it works out. And yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question, and I like this one. It's a bit funny. This person had a yoga class outside this week, and what looked like hoverflies were all over them. Someone said they were licking us and they were just tickling annoyance. Did they want out, or were they just thirsty?
Great question. And it could be that you had sweat bees on you too. They're really attracted to perspiration also. But yeah, hoverflies are also attracted to perspiration. They really like the salt, so they're just there to lap up the salt, and it does tickle. Absolutely. But yeah, it's not harmful to you, and it's beneficial to the hoverflies who really can't get salt a lot of different ways. And so yeah, some hoverflies and some sweat bees really are abundant this time of year when it's extra hot outside.
Thank you everyone so much for coming today, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much again, Jennifer, for a wonderful presentation.
I'm so happy to do it. Thank you very, very much, everybody. You had great questions. I'm really glad to be here today. Thanks, Rachel.
Of course. Bye, everyone.